lot to cover tonight. And as you see, this is being recorded, and we will send you a link to the YouTube channel. Welcome to the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust first webinar of 2023. The topic tonight is the Jewish background of Ellie Wiesel's night. My name is Lee Holder. I'm a member of the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust, and I am Region 2 Director with Holocaust Education for the state. And before I present our speaker, our presenter for tonight, who we're very excited to have, I wanted to introduce you to the Region 2 co-directors, and they're also the co-hosts this evening. And we're going to start with Meredith and then go to Lindsay and then to Cindy.
Hey there, I am Meredith Howell. I'm a Region 2 co-director with the North Carolina Council on the Holocaust, and I teach in Stanley County, and where I teach English 3, English 4, and I just recently was notified I get to teach a Holocaust elective this semester, so I'm really excited. Thank you guys for coming. I do appreciate it. Another thing for me, I am going to be running the chat box throughout our presentation or throughout our webinar tonight. And I'll post a little comment in the chat box. If you have any pertinent questions, please put those in the chat box. We'll pause throughout the webinar, and I'll make sure to highlight a few of them. And once again, if we don't get to your question, we will make sure that we submit those to the applicable person and get you guys answers for those. Thank you.
I'm Lindsay Jones. I'm also a Region 2 co-director. I actually teach in Nash County, which is in Region 3. And I am a media coordinator and also a creative writing teacher. And I'm happy to be with you guys tonight.
Hi, I'm Cindy Keller, and I'm the third of this group. I teach in Kannapolis City Schools, which is between 2 counties, which is why I don't say the county. And I teach 6th grade social studies. We're so glad you all have come tonight.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Rabbi Gutman is the Rabbi Emeritus of Temple Emmanuel in Greensboro, North Carolina. He served as a principal at I believe it's the Alexander Muss High School in Israel. He was also the rabbi there and helped write the curriculum that's being used in Israel. He serves as a regional director of the International March of the Living. In 2002, Rabbi Gutman received the Lifetime Community Service Award for his work in civil rights from the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. And this summer, the rabbi has done a Herculean task and raised funding to lead a group of North Carolina educators on a Holocaust trip to Poland. We're very excited to have him tonight, and I could have gone on for a long time about all of his accolades, but I will stop there so we can actually hear his presentation. Thank you, Rabbi, for joining us.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm really grateful to the council for this opportunity to share with you how I, as a rabbi, see certain things in night and see that relate to the fact that Ellie Wiesel comes out of such a traditional Jewish background. I just wanted to mention that the book that I'm going to be using and referring to is the most recent book that actually there were some changes made by Wiesel's wife when this was made. And so if there are page numbers that are cited, you'll know that that's where that's where you can find it. There's not enough time, folks, to read everything tonight that is going to be cited in the PowerPoint. The assumption is that if you're a teacher and you're teaching the book, you have a good background. The PowerPoint is yours after this. If you want a copy, or maybe we'll just send out a copy, it's yours to use. And the PowerPoint also will contain suggestions for questions and additional assignments, as well as other curricular issues. So let's go to the next slide, please. So there have been many first-person accounts published by Holocaust survivors, and the question really becomes, why is this one so important historically, and why is it considered to be a literary masterpiece? And I should actually say that other than the Diary of Anne Frank, which I respect, but I don't think it's that useful for teaching the history of the Holocaust. This is the most frequently read Holocaust book and frequently used in terms of teaching and curriculum. So let's go to the next slide, and we'll try to answer that. Historically, this book is very significant, okay? Although there was, and we'll get to this later tonight, a version that was done in the Yiddish language prior to 1958. And we also know that when he was in Buchenwald, that Wiesel started writing notes to this. The French edition, which was the most important edition that really, or the original edition that came out, and the English edition only came out in 1960. And the book began to sell well and increase the consciousness of the Holocaust throughout the world because of B, and this is critical, the capture of Adolf Eichmann. Eichmann was the Minister of Transportation of the Third Reich. He was responsible in one way or another for 73% of the deaths of the 6 million. The trial, he was captured in Argentina. The trial began in 1961, received worldwide attention from both Jews and non-Jews. So the fact that this trial happened and that this incredible autobiography or this incredible novel came out, autobiographical novel around the same time is not insignificant in terms of the worldwide attention that it got. Next slide, please. So why is it such a, from a literary point of view, a brilliant novel? It has to do with his style, which I think most of you can appreciate. Has to do with the fact that in its final version, the French and English version, it has a real appeal to both Jews and non-Jews. It's particularistic. It has the ability to speak to Jews and also to assure them that the experiences that they faced were unique in the history of humankind. And it also has an ability to speak to the world. There's a universal meaning to it, and it must be applied to other situations. As I said before, the popularity of the book is second only to that of the Diary of Anne Frank. So I wanted just to point out, because this is going to be one of the themes that we'll wrap around later on, is that it's very important in the last edition, in the French and the English editions of Knight, to pay attention to the way the book begins and the way the book ends. In my opinion, this is the article I've yet to write, because I think that there is a significant connection between the beginning and the end of the book, and I'll spell it out for you later in the second half. Okay, so I want to start with Moshe the Beadle. And Moshe the Beadle is a Kabbalist. He's a Jewish mystic. And without going into this in great theological detail, I just want to give you some idea of what that would mean. It means that as a man, Moshe the Beadle, a beadle is a janitor, is trying to get as close to God as possible. In Hebrew, the word is dvekut, which comes from the word glue, to glue. He's trying to glue himself to God and God's will. He is a deeply observant man. He tries to observe all of the commandments as found in Scripture and the Torah. And foremost among these was the commandment to obey the Sabbath. He talks about the Shekhinah. This is the divine presence of God, sometimes called the feminine divine presence of God. For the Kabbalists, for the Jewish mystic, God is both masculine and feminine. The idea is that if he can do the commandments, he can effectuate a repair of the world, and the Shekhinah, that God will no longer be in exile. In other words, it's possible through doing good deeds, doing the commandments, to bring more of God's presence to the world. This is really, and you have to be very intentional about that. Let's continue. So one other idea I want to share with you is this idea called Pardes. Pardes, it really comes, the English word paradise actually comes from it. And in Jewish mysticism, Pardes really means two things. Number one, it means that a person who enters the Pardes enters the realm of mystical speculation. And in that realm, there is four ways of interpreting text, okay? The simplest way is what the simple and literal interpretation is. The second one has as remez called hint or suggestion. The third is a drash, giving an insight. And the fourth, which is key for us here, is called the sod, the secret or the mystery of the text. The Kabbalist will work through all of these, but he'll try to reach the sod as his ultimate goal. So let's go on. When we come back to Moshe the Beetle, he's a janitor. And why, I would ask our students, why is Ellie attracted to him? And the answer is because what he wants from him, he wants to study Jewish mysticism. He wants to study Kabbalah. And go to the next one. And if you see this on the next slide, you have to understand that basically his community is not going to let a teenage boy study Jewish mysticism. It's just, there's a feeling you have to know a lot of Jewish law and Jewish lore and the Jewish books before you can ever do this. And there are three quotes here, or two quotes from Jewish tradition as to why this is really not permitted. And the community doesn't want him to. His father doesn't want him to. No one wants him, Ellie, as a teenage boy, to study the secrets of Jewish theology and Jewish mysticism. He's simply too young and not well enough educated. Go on. So we talked about the sod, the secrets of God in the universe. This is what Ellie wants from Moshe the Beetle. And if you reread at this point, you reread the first three pages, you can see that in this dialogue, all of which is particular to deportation, there's a lot of things that now we can understand a little bit better because of the fact that we just have a little bit of knowledge as to what Jewish mysticism is. And if you look on page 5 of the book that I have, at the bottom of the page, he says, and in the course of those evenings, I became convinced that Moshe the Beetle would help me enter eternity, into the time when question and answer would be one, or would be one with God. The idea of a unity of question and answer, a unity through gluing oneself to God's will or with God, is a big thing in a big concept in Jewish mysticism. And it is what Ellie wants to know, because he thinks if he can become at one with God, okay, and if he can learn that secret, the ultimate secret of becoming one with God, then and only then can he rest assured that eternity will be his. Next one. So here's the thing. So when Moshe the Beetle returns, what is the new secret? And I'd ask the kids, and those of you who teach this know that the new secret is that Jews are being killed. And the sad thing, it's within this context that no one believes it. Eventually, Moshe the Beetle keeps on telling me, and eventually, what does he do? He becomes silent, and silence is a big part of this. He becomes silent. So the old secret of being at one with God, okay, has now been replaced by the new secret that Jews are being killed, and you people, and no one else believes him. He almost as though he's a prophet. He's telling this, okay, to people. You don't believe, okay? You don't believe what I've seen, but I have seen it, and they're killing Jews. And then I'd ask the kids, but I wouldn't answer it at this moment. Where else in the book is something like this secret being presented? And obviously, for those of you who teach it, there's several places, but the one I had in mind is Madam Schachter. Go ahead, please. Now, I'm not going to go this. There was a Yiddish writer named Yehuda Leib Peretz who actually, Elie Wiesel was very much intrigued by him. And Peretz wrote a book called A Bunch of the Silent, about the Jew who never complained and just took the blows from everybody else. And when he went to heaven, the angel said to him, because you never complained, we are going to allow you to go into heaven through this heavenly tribunal. And God asked him, well, what do you want now? And he said, you're such a righteous man. What do you want? And he answered him, what I want is a piece of toast with butter on it every morning. And at that point, the angels laughed at how pathetic this man was, because he, in his silence, he had become accepting of all of the injustice done to him and focused totally on himself. Now, Peretz did this as a way in which he was critiquing the Jewish community of his time, several decades before Wiesel. But this theme of silence is one that we're going to come back to several times. Go ahead, please. Next slide. Okay, I'm not going to go over these. There's actually between 3 and 4, there's a mistake there. Silence encourages the tormentor never to be tormented. I have that in twice. But these, for teachers, these are great quotes that you can give out to the kids when you talk about the theme of silence, and or ask them to write something and creatively about it. Like, look, I swore never to be silent whenever and wherever human beings endure suffering and humiliation. Great. Give that to a kid and say, based on what you learned in the book, and based upon your present reality, give me your feelings. Give me an interpretation of that. Okay. And of course, at the end, if somebody is this theme of God goes all through here. The fifth quote has to do with his challenging of God, and that God is there in silence, whatever that means. I have my own idea, but that doesn't necessarily mean that my idea is correct. Go on. Okay, there are 4 aspects of the theme of silence in the book. One is God's silence in the face of evil. The second one is existential, the dead don't speak, and the mute don't speak. Third is language can't describe what has occurred, so it's silent. And fourth is the realm of testimony. Sometimes silence will seem to be the only response, and he will break out of that only years later. Remember, the war is over in 1945, and the book is not published for a variety of reasons until 1958. So overcoming that silence to give testimony is something that he finds very challenging within his own life. Go ahead. But there's another idea about silence, and that is on page 19. Again, I'm using this book if you have it. On page 19, he talks about the silence of bystanders. And that's a big theme for me. 3/4 of the way down the page, he said, they ordered us to run. We began to run. Who would thought that we were so strong? And here it comes. From behind the windows, behind the shutters, our fellow citizens watched as we passed. If you know the story of Kitty Genovese, it's there again. So there's actually this silence of the bystanders, which could be a 5th example of silence in there. And later on, I'm going to suggest that if you had signed an extra credit assignment on night, you could give a kid an assignment, write me a paper on the theme of silence. Now, there's another theme here, and that is that during the Holocaust, the sane is insane, the traditional is irrational, and what appears to be truth might not be so. In other words, there's an inversion of belief, appearance, and values. Now, next slide. Where this really comes in is the story of Madame Schachter, which is a key story in the book. A key story in the book. The train rolls into Auschwitz II, which is Birkenau, where there are 4 gas chambers. The 2 large ones, crematory 2 and 3, are there. There's a selection. I have you and I both have pictures of this selection. And on the way, of course, Madame Schachter is screaming out, "I see a fire! I see a fire!" And everyone thinks that she's totally nuts. She's totally insane. But then when they get there, they see at the end of these tracks on the platform, when they get off, or even when they're still on the train, they see the pillars, okay, the chimneys, sorry, of the crematorium where the flame is coming out. And by the way, he doesn't mention, but there's also a smell. There's a smell of burning human flesh. One of the survivors said that it reminded her of when her mother would burn off the feathers of a chicken, burning skin. And they would see that. And all of a sudden, okay, the crazy person, Madam Schachter, becomes the prophetic voice in terms of this is happening and you really need to pay attention to it. Let's go on. Okay. I also wanted to point out that the Jewish prayer for the dead is called the Kaddish, okay? And Wiesel has to, if you lose there's 7 types of people that you say this prayer for most instances the whole year: a father, mother, sister, brother, son, a daughter, or a spouse. And he, on page 33, he talks about that God has chosen to be silent. And if you go on, I'm trying to run through this, but it's worth seeing. This is a very, very important prayer that is said by a mourner every day during this time for one of those 7. Go ahead, Cindy, for the next one. Okay. So here's some more quotes about the first night in camp. God is silent, even dead. Ellie's soul has been murdered, killed. The student who I was consumed in flame. And then on page 45, you have a wonderful quote about God. As for me, he says, I have ceased to pray. I was not denying existence, but I doubted his absolute justice. Keep on going. Next slide. And then you have this incredibly powerful scene about the hanging of 2 people in a small pillow, a child. And at the end of it, if you're teaching, you remember that one person, and this is at the bottom of page 64, asks, well, where is God? Where is God now? And Wiesel hears somebody from behind him saying, this is where, hanging from this gallows. That night, the soup tasted of corpses. So keep on going. Okay. And I have this, so much of what the book is about. It's about Wiesel's wrestling with faith. He doesn't really say that he lost all faith. It's almost as though God is silent, okay, and God is not in justice. Okay, he says at the bottom here, no, I have faith, but I still question it. Keep on going. Okay. On page 66 to 68, he wrestles with God. Okay. He refers to himself as a former mystic, a former Kabbalist. Okay. And here, if I was teaching, I would ask the kids, why do you think that's so important? And really what it is that it shows his transition from the kid who was learning with Moshe the Beetle, learning with the Jewish mystic, and that's why I asked who's the other Jewish mystic that he had met, into this person who either challenges God or just feels that God is irrelevant. Go ahead. Next slide. On Yom Kippur, now here we get to it. It's the book goes through. Yom Kippur is the Jewish Day of Atonement. On that day, Jews fast. We ask other people for forgiveness, and we ask God for forgiveness. And here's something that is a really big deal. Because on Yom Kippur, on page 68, for the first time in his life, Ellie Wiesel doesn't fast. He's not asking God for forgiveness. Some people say that God should be asking him for forgiveness. But God is silent. And again, the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, is the holiest day of the Jewish year. And when he chooses not to fast, it is a very momentous moment for him in terms of his faith and what has happened to his faith and his attachment to Jewish tradition as a result of the experiences that he's had, not the least of which is the death of his beloved father. Go ahead. Okay. I'm going to skip through this because I want to get through question time. I just want to go back one slide and then we'll stop for questions. On page 76, he mentions that he forgot to say the Kaddish memorial prayer. Now, what does that mean? Again, this is his decision not to fast on Yom Kippur. This is a very, very big deal. Okay, that his father's died. Jewish tradition mandates that he say Kaddish. The Kaddish prayer actually does not mention the death. It's kind of a hymn of praise to God. That the Jewish mystic believes that when he says it, that the person, some Jewish mystics believe that when they say it, that the person's soul, the holy soul of the person who he's saying it for, is standing next to them for that moment, and they're saying this praises of God. This is a huge, huge deal. Okay, and if I had more time, I'd go into what this means, forgetting to say the Kaddish. Okay. So let's take the slides down right now. And it's 7:26. And according to Lee, at this point, I'm supposed to ask questions. I'm supposed to answer questions. So it's all yours. First of all, I'm amazed that I did all of that in that amount of time. That is a miracle, only paralleled by the splitting of the sea for the ancient Israelites. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Rabbi. So in the chat box, Stephanie Wallace has a question. It says, my students get hung up on Moshe's words about asking the God within himself the right questions. In that instance, is this separate from prayer life, or is that essentially the same?
Yes, it is separate from prayer. I'd have to look at the specific passage, but what I think is that it's more than prayer. Okay, it's being in dialogue with God as a Jewish mystic. And by the way, it's not only the Jewish mystics, but when Jacob wrestles with the angel, he receives a new name, Israel. And Israel means the person who struggled with God. So asking questions of God is something, and this is prior to Moshe's deportation. This is something that is very much accepted in Judaism. And more than that, is a fundamental part, I would say, of the life of the Jewish mystic. He's not afraid to ask the difficult questions because he's hoping that he can get to a stage of yichud, of unity, of oneness with God through asking those questions. So, who asked the question, Meredith?
It's Stephanie Wallace.
Stephanie, was that answer okay, or do you want to follow up on it?
That explains it some. They get caught up in the concept of Christians believing in the indwelling of the Holy Spirit and whether that's the same thing when he says the God within himself. And again, their biggest question is that the same thing at prayer, which you addressed. So thank you so much.
Yeah, it's probably not exactly the same thing. But Jews do believe that there's an aspect of divine in each person's soul. We would never call it the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. That's really Christian theology. But they do believe that Jews do believe that the soul is holy and is a gift from God, and that there's an aspects of godliness within every person's soul. Good.
Okay.
Next
All
question.
right. So we don't have any more questions right now, but I do want to encourage everyone, if you do have questions, just put those in the chat box and we will pause again to address those. So we'll continue on.
Oh my gosh. That's okay. All right. So we're going slower this time. All right. I want to spend the rest of the time focusing on the ending. But before I focus on the ending, I want you to understand that my theory is that the ending is a bookend to the beginning. That the ending, in some way or another, although it's not mentioned, is reflective of Wiesel's experience with Moshe the Beetle. Okay, so I want to show you this. We know that that Wiesel started writing both in Yiddish and in Hebrew very shortly, first in Buchwald and then afterwards. And he wrote actually a book in Yiddish that was 4 times as long as the it was 4 times as long as the original, as the night that we have. Now, I want to just share with you a couple of things about that, because I think it's of critical importance. So let me just get my note here. Okay. So look, he begins to write this book, which in Yiddish has a different title. It's not known as Night, but in Yiddish it would be known as Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, which means and the world kept silent. Now you think about this. Silence is a big, big theme for him in this. We've already seen it. But he writes this book that's longer than the one, and it's called The World and the World Kept Silence. Now, the theme of silence, again, in all of its dimensions, is a theme that dominates the commentary on night. But here, and according to a memoir that Wiesel wrote in 1944, he says that this Yiddish version of what became Night was actually submitted for publication in 1954. That would be 4 years before the publication in French and 6 years before the publication in English. Some of the times it's referred to as the original Yiddish version of Night, but it's not, because it's 245 pages, and in the French book it's 158. So it's much more. It's much longer, and what distinguishes it, in my opinion, is not so much its length, but it's as its attention to detail and an adherence to being comprehensive. So, so what happens is that there's certain things, particularly in the end of this book, that are very, very different in comparison to the end of the Book of Night. So what I'm going to do now is let's read very carefully the original ending. And if you have the book in front of you, you might want to turn, because we'll come back to this, to the ending of the book, which in my copy is on page 100 and let's see. Whoops, I gotta find it. Yeah. There you go, on 113. So here he says, 3 days after the liberation, I became very ill, food poisoning. They took me to the hospital and the doctor said I was gone. Now, by the way, this was not uncommon. And some of it, at times, it was not just food poisoning, but the people's stomachs had shrunk so much that well-meaning soldiers would give them a loaf of bread, people would drink, and then their stomachs would explode and they would bleed to death internally. As a matter of fact, the people and Buchenwald and elsewhere that were liberated were so sick that a lot of them thought that it was only a matter of time before they died. So he says, for 2 weeks, I lay in the hospital between life and death, and my situation grew from worse day to day. One fine day, I got up with the last of my energy, and I went over to the mirror that was hanging on the wall. I wanted to see myself. I had not seen myself since the ghetto. From the mirror, a skeleton gazed out, skin and bones. Now, I have a friend, a blessed memory, Lily Kopetsky, who actually was the head of the Survivors of Auschwitz Association for about 5 years. And for, I think, 1 year, they brought her into Emory and she taught there. But Lily would tell a story that was very similar to this, that when she first, after being in the hospital for weeks, when she first got up and looked at herself in the mirror, that she went into something like cardiac arrest. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. She couldn't believe the ugliness of the face and the emaciated character of the face that was staring back at her. So here he says, from the mirror, a skeleton gazed out. It was skin and bones. Okay. By the way, I don't know if you can get the Yiddish book, but if you want, in just a minute, I will give you the name of an article by Naomi Seidman, who wrote an article comparing these, on which a lot of this research is based. So he says, I saw the image of myself after my death. Now that's very similar to the end that we have. And it was at that instant that the will to live was awakened. Okay. Now that is not necessarily, that's not in the night ending. And it's also interesting to note that that is somewhat unusual, at least to what had happened to Lily Kopecki, because when she saw herself in the mirror, she didn't want to live. So now here's something that's very different. Without knowing why, I raised a balled up fist and smashed the mirror, breaking the image that lived in it. Now, if you think about it, that does not happen at night. That does not happen at night. And the question is, what happened in those intervening years that would have caused him to change that ending? It's a very powerful ending, because when he punches the mirror, he's saying the dead person, the corpse, the skin and bones doesn't exist, but that's not what he does in night. Okay, go to the next one. This is very powerful. And then he fainted like Lily did. From that moment on, my health began to improve. I stayed in bed a few more days. And again, he began to improve because he had smashed the mirror with the corpse in it. And in the course of which I wrote the outline of the book you were holding in your hand, dear reader. But now, 10 years after Buchenwald, this is 10 years later that he's talking about this, I see that the world is forgetting. Germany is a sovereign nation. The German army has been reborn. The bestial sadist of Buchenwald, Ilse Koch, has been happily raising her children. She actually was eventually brought to justice as a war criminal. You can look her up. War criminals stroll in the streets of Hamburg and Munich. The past has been erased, forgotten. So if you look at this, and this is not in the thing, something has happened, and he says, I am really upset because this happened, and 9-10 years later, the world is forgetting, and those who did this to Jews are living in the streets of Germany happily raising their children. It's all been forgotten. Germans and anti-Semites persuade the world that the story of 6 million Jewish martyrs is a fantasy, and the naive world will probably believe them, if not today, then tomorrow or the next day. So I thought it would be a good idea to publish the book based on the notes I wrote at Buchenwald. I'm not so naive to believe that this book will change history or shape people's beliefs. Books no longer have the power that they once had. Those who were silent yesterday will be silent tomorrow. And I often ask myself, let me just click off this. I often ask myself, 10 years after Buchan, look at this. Was it worth breaking the mirror? Wow. That's the question. Now, let's understand something. What I don't have on this is how it happened that in 5 or 6 years, what he wrote in this original book, which, by the way, was not a success at all. It was not a success. It was part of a collection in Yiddish of other survivors of testimonies. It was not a collection, not a success at all. So what happened in the intervening years that really caused him to change not only the ending of the book, but much of the book? And the answer is that when he was in France, he wanted to get the book published, and he wrote a translation of it in French and gave it to a French Catholic author who is actually quite famous, Francois Mauriac. And he gave it to Mauriac, and the two of them began to look at the book and to debate it. The interesting, Mauriac was a very devout Catholic, and he kind of saw the book as being the sacrifice of children, and they actually had discussions as to whether or not this was because the Jews had not accepted Jesus. And Wiesel was very hesitant to do anything which might blame the French people, the French collaborators. But Mauriac actually comes to him and says, look, you know what? This book will not work as it is. You need to change it. This book is filled with bitterness, and it's filled with a desire to exact revenge. For example, in the, I don't have it here, but in the Yiddish version, the idea of going out, okay, our first, in page 113, our first act as free men was to throw ourselves into revisions, not the thought of revenge or parents, only bread. And even when we were no longer hungry, not one of us thought of revenge. Now that is, whether it's true or not, it is not the emphasis of the original Yiddish. The emphasis of the original Yiddish is revenge and bringing people to justice. And there is even a Hebrew translation of the Yiddish, which says that the next day, a few young men went into Weimar to bring back some potatoes and to sleep with girls. The Hebrew translation actually has them to rape girls, that was an act of revenge. And Mauriac said, there's got to be a different message if you want the non-Jewish world to understand this book and to relate to it and to really hear your testimony, So if you have the book, look on page 113, okay? And look what he says here. This is, instead of that long ending that we just read, he says, 3 days after the liberation, Bourgeois became very ill, some sort of food poisoning. I was transferred to a hospital and spent 2 weeks between life and death. One day I was able to get up. I decided to look at myself in the mirror. I had not seen myself since the ghetto. From the depths of the mirror, a corpse was contemplating me, okay? And I think that at that moment he says, well, what now? And how? How am I going to live? And he says, the look in his eyes as he gazed at me never left me. That is so different than the original ending. And you can see that something else is going on here. And without it, Mauriac believed, and I think he was right, that it would have never been a commercial success and would have never been widely accepted, not only by the Jewish world, but by the non-Jewish world. So if you go to the next slide, here is a comment from Naomi Seidman's article, where she says, by stopping when it does, night provides an entirely different account of the experience of the survivor. Night in the stories about its composition depict the survivor as a witness and as an expression of silence and death, projecting the recently liberated Eliezer's death-haunted face into the post-war years when Wiesel would become a familiar figure. By contrast, the Yiddish survivor shatters that image as soon as he sees it, destroying the deathly existence that the Nazis willed on him. The Yiddish survivor is filled with rage and a desire to live, to take revenge, to write. Indeed, according to the Yiddish memoir, Eliezer began to write not 10 years after the events of the Holocaust, but immediately upon liberation as the first expression of his mental and physical recovery. In the Yiddish, we meet a survivor who 10 years after liberation is furious at the world's disinterest in its history, frustrated with the failure of the Jews to fulfill the historical commandment of revenge, and depressed by the apparent pointlessness of writing the book. Go to the next slide. But while you do that, I want to say that I think it is very important that if you do this and you show his changing of the thought from revenge to what I'm going to show you right now, that you have to say, well, what is the difference between smashing the mirror and looking at it? Okay. Because when he looks at it, he sees the corpse, but he says, that corpse has never left me. Now, here's an intriguing possibility that, to the best of my knowledge, there might be less than 50 people in the world that actually believe that this is a possibility. I'm one of them. According to Judaism, there are 6,000 root souls in the world. This approximates the numbers of letter in the 5 books of Moses. And there's also a concept called Gilgul Nishamot. And this is not reincarnation, but recycling of the souls. In other words, that like part of my soul could have somebody else's soul from before, not the whole thing, but a part of it. Like, for example, in Jewish tradition, Chaim Ibn Attar says that Moses has part of the soul of Abel and Rabbi Akiva has part of the soul of Cain. Okay, so that's fine. So the question that I ask, and this actually will be significant, even if you just say it's a possibility, is it possible that Wiesel viewed himself in the aftermath of the Shoah as having part of Moshe the Beetle's soul within him? Okay, that he was kind of the recycling of Moshe the Beetle's soul. Go to the next. Now, why is this important? Okay, again, if you look on page 113, the corpse was contemplating me. He looks at himself in the mirror and he sees a corpse back at him, looking back at him. So in a way, he's saying that the Eliezer or the Elie Wiesel of the Holocaust and of the community before the Holocaust was now dead, And if that's so, then the next question is, okay, but he's not dead. But if Elie Wiesel during the Holocaust and prior to the Holocaust was dead, then who is Elie Wiesel today? Okay, now I'm going to show you in just a second why this is important. But I just want to stick in here the most famous quote before I get to the end, the most famous quote from Wiesel, which says, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. The opposite of art is not ugliness, it's indifference. The opposite of faith is not heresy, it's indifference. And the opposite of life is not death, it's indifference. This is a good topic for an essay for kids to write on in relationship to the book, particularly if it's higher achieving kids. What does it mean to you? I would ask the kids, and what should it mean to us? Okay, now go to the next one. And here you see it, okay? 2002, at a gathering of survivors and their descendants, Wiesel said the following, and think about this in relationship tonight as a whole, and the beginning with Moshe the Beetle and the end where he talks about that he is dead. He meaning Wiesel. He says, I believe firmly and profoundly that whoever listens to a witness becomes a witness. By the way, this is an incredibly powerful statement. 1/3 of my family died in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. Okay, I was born in 1952, 7 years after the war. So everything I know, and the reason why I've been teaching this for 40 years, is not firsthand. But when I read this, I think about all of the witnesses that I've listened to and how they've affected me. But it's even more than that, because there are so few witnesses left. Years ago, 15 years ago, I took a group of people to Poland on the March of the Living, and we had with us 4 survivors. 4 survivors. We couldn't even consider that today. In our congregation, in the Jewish community in Greensboro, we have, best of my knowledge, only 2 survivors left. We used to have in Greensboro 3 people that were on the kinder transport. They're all gone. So I believe firmly and profoundly that whoever listens to a witness, this is your students, folks, becomes a witness, okay? Because how are they listening to witness? You can find lots of witness testimony online, and you should use it. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful. And both the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington and Yad Vashem in Israel have plenty of survivors' testimonies. But I would maintain that just as powerful as that is, that reading and digging into this book night is just as powerful, and it is listening to Wiesel, who's gone now. But when we do this, we become a witness. So those who hear us, those who read us, he's saying, must continue to bear witness for us. This is why what you are doing when you're teaching these children, with these students, is so important. This is not about whether somebody gets an A or B. It's not about Democrats or Republicans or Democrats, right or left or right. This is about right versus wrong and bearing witness, okay? Bearing witness. Until now, he says, they're doing it with us. This he writes in 2002. At a certain point in time, by which he means when there's no more survivors, they will do it for all of us. Wow. Look at the importance of what you're doing when you teach. It's absolutely incredible. You are not only teaching for knowledge, you're teaching to create good, responsible, just, and kind human beings that not only bear witness, but by bearing witness, become essentially upstanders instead of bystanders. Go on to the next slide, please. Okay. So I put in here just other possibility for additional assignments if you want, and go to the next slide. I think that might be it. Yeah, go on a little bit more. This is background for results. Okay, to take the slides off, you can all look at that later. But again, the idea is that in some way or another, at the end, when Wiesel has died, he's become in his life Moshe the Beetle. Now, what is the thing that's the most incredible? What does Moshe the Beetle do? He goes around telling everybody, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. And what do they say? Nothing. Silence. They don't believe him. And that, friends, was Wiesel's biggest worry, that he would be just ignored. So let me just mention one thing before we start on the questions. I don't have it here, but there's maybe somebody can look it up and find. There's an article by Naomi Seidman, Seidman, which I think is called. Here I have the title of it, but I should have put it in. Elie Wiesel and the Scandal of Jewish Rage. Okay, it was published in 1996. This, if you want to deal with the two endings, this is a very good article. Elie Wiesel in the Standard Jewish Age. Maybe somebody can find it and put it in the chat for us. Okay, so again, I come back to this. Okay, when we teach, okay, this book, which by the way, I have to tell you, I think this book is so much more important than the Diary of Anne Frank. As a matter of fact, if I could stop people from teaching the Diary of Anne Frank, I wouldn't be upset. But this is a must for every high school or middle school teacher, whatever. As long as the kids can have the reading ability to do it, to go over this book. I actually was at a high school in Nashville and gave a lecture to 8th graders on this, and they gave me a standing ovation. You know, rabbis never get any standing ovations. Okay. I got a standing ovation for teaching them about night. It was unbelievable. You know, the difference between rabbis and ministers is that on Christmas, people walk out of the church and they say, good sermon, pastor. And on our holidays, they walk in and say, that was okay, but, you know, so rabbis never get standing ovations. Crazy. But anyway, this is so important. We are making witnesses here. And by doing that, we are making kind, compassionate, and just upstander human beings. That, my friends, it very well might be in the book of Esther. Mordecai says to Esther, it very well might be that for this moment in history, you were created. And I think that applies to you, particularly those people on this who are teachers. Maybe this is the reason why, if you'll excuse the theology, you were created.